صلوا على محمد وآل محمد.
اللهم صل على
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. سورة الفاتحة. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين بارئ الخلائق أجمعين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين المبعوث رحمة للعالمين شفيع المذنبين وحبيب قلوب الصادقين سيدنا ومولانا أبي القاسم محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعلى أهل بيته الأطيبين الأطهرين الهداة المهديين، ولعنة الله على أعدائهم إلى قيام يوم الدين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. أما بعد، فقد قال الله عز وجل: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. من عمل صالحا من ذكر أو أنثى وهو مؤمن فلنحيينه حياة طيبة ولنجزينهم أجرهم بأحسن ما كانوا يعملون. صلوات. Dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Inshallah, in these sessions that we will be together, I want to briefly explore this verse of Quran in Surah An-Nahl, in which Allah says that whoever does good deeds, whether it be a man or a woman, min dhakarin aw untha, and who is a believer, who has faith, who is a mu'min, then Allah has promised certain things. First, لَنُحْيِيَنَّهُ حَيَاةً طَيِّبَةً. That person has been given a guarantee by Allah that he or she will have a pure, a tayyib life, a good life, a pure life. وَلَنَجْزِيَنَّهُمْ أَجْرَهُمْ بِأَحْسَنِ مَا كَانُوا يَعْمَلُونَ. And they will be given their reward by Allah according to the very best of the actions that they used to perform in this life. Now this is a very hopeful verse in the Quran. It gives all of us a great deal of hope that it is possible for us to obtain salvation and the divine promise of the best of this world and the best of the hereafter. It talks about how the life of a believer will be in this life. It talks about what the reward of a believer will be like in the hereafter, and very briefly, in summary, it doesn't give us a long list, a checklist of what things you have to believe and what things you have to do. That checklist is implicit in the verse, because to have faith means that we have to have faith in what God has revealed, and what we know to be the truth, we have to be willing to submit to that which is good. To do good deeds, we have to have the right intention. Otherwise, a deed is not good simply by virtue of the effect that it has. It is good by virtue of the relationship that the action in the external world has to the doer, to the soul of the person who is doing that action. And so it is implicit within this verse that there are certain conditions, but there is a reason why Allah does not mention those conditions in detail in every verse. We shouldn't interpret the verse and say, I'm going to do tafsir and I'm going to make explicit everything that Allah made implicit. Sometimes there's a reason why Allah kept certain things unstated, because it is sometimes in the interest of our religious development, in order simply to see the larger picture. If we get lost in the forest, then we might not be able to implement even those details that we are looking at very well. But if we see the larger picture, and we see that it is not meant to be an obstacle course, it is not meant to be something that is going to trip us up, and designed to be a course that will make it impossible or difficult for a person to succeed in, that is a great deal of the challenge of this life that we will be able to overcome. Now, to make that a little bit more clear, I want to give an example that many of our communities are suffering in. Recently I was informed that there was an email that was circulating that Coke and Pepsi, they have certain products which might be from a questionable or from a haram source, and people were questioning that, are we allowed to consume these soft drinks or not? Periodically there will be a similar email that will come, or a rumor that will spread, or some other means by which people will say, is this cheese product, is this snack, is this drink, is this food, is this restaurant, is it permissible or impermissible for us to eat? Now, on the one hand, there are some people who take this issue very seriously. If you tell them that this snack, which is produced by Kraft Foods, for example, has been rumored to be forbidden in Islam, that it might contain products which are haram, so they will look on the website, and then they will call the public relations division of Kraft Foods, and they will get the ingredient list, and they will find out one way or another, and then they will consider it their duty to let everybody else know, whether the people want to find out or whether they don't want to find out. So there are some people who take this issue very seriously. There are other people who say that, no, I have read the fatwa says that you don't need to ask. The only requirement is that if I know something contains meat, then I have to make sure the meat is from a proper Islamic source, that it is halal, that is dhabiha. If I know that a food contains fish, then I have to find out if that fish is a fish that can be consumed or not. You can't just automatically go to a seafood restaurant and say that, well, it is fish. There are types of fish which are not permitted for us to eat according to the school of Ahlul Bayt, and there are other types of fish or other types of seafood which is permissible for us to eat. We can't consume lobster and shark and many other types of seafood, and we can consume some types. So simply for me to know that a certain product has seafood in it or is a certain type of fish, it doesn't mean that I can close my eyes and assume it is halal. I have to say that what kind of fish is in this meal. And if it is a mixture, then I have to make sure that those ingredients are halal. So these two restrictions we do have in Islamic fiqh. If I know it contains meat, I can't say, well, there is a 10% chance that the meat is halal. I can assume it is okay. If I know it contains fish, I can't say that, well, at least some types of fish are halal, because I know it contains that ingredient. I have to make sure that that ingredient is from a halal source. But if I don't know whether it contains a meat product at all, if I don't know whether it contains a fish product at all, in that case I don't need, and I am not required Islamically, to do the research and find out if the food that I am consuming contains that meat product, and therefore whether that meat product is halal, or whether it doesn't contain that meat product, and therefore I can assume that it is halal. To make that clear, whether it be some manufactured product, whether it be food from a restaurant, whether it be food that is prepared by some individual on a personal basis that we know, if we are not aware of that food containing anything which is forbidden for us to eat, or not aware of that food containing meat, or not aware of that food containing seafood, we don't need to go and do the research Islamically and legally and fiqh-wise in order to ascertain that it is halal. So they say that this is the ruling that we have from all of our maraji'. It is expressed in our books of fiqh and in the fatwas and the rulings of our maraji'. And so I am going to buy the Skittles, I am going to buy the Doritos, I am going to eat the pizza from this restaurant, and don't tell me. Or if you want to tell me, let me finish what I'm doing, and then tell me after I've already swallowed it and washed it down with a soft drink, and then if you need to tell me, you can tell me. So we have two ends of the extreme, and both of them can make a case that what they are doing is Islamic. In some cases it's a sincere case that can be made. In some cases it's just a matter of us justifying what we are predisposed or inclined to do. What is the case for those who take it very seriously and are strict? They say that Allah has made certain things halal for us and Allah has made certain things haram for us. If Allah made pork and pork products and those foods or ingredients derived from pork forbidden for us, it was because He didn't intend us to eat them. And even if we might have a religious justification for, in some cases, not doing research and therefore, without knowing it, consuming certain things, even if we might not be religiously liable and punishable, it still will have an effect on our soul. Wine or alcohol was not forbidden simply because it is an evil act to deliberately drink wine or alcohol. It was forbidden because even if I do so accidentally, it has certain harms for the believer, for the body and for the soul. And that is why Allah has forbidden it. So I should try to avoid that consumption of something that is forbidden by Allah, even if it is not deliberate. Because if I don't do it deliberately, I'm not liable, I'm not going to be punished in the hereafter. But will my body still suffer the consequences of having consumed that food which Allah did not consider it appropriate for me to eat? Yes. And so that is a justification of those who take that very strict path. But then there is also a justification, hard as it might be to believe, for those who say that no, we should not take that strict path. What is their justification? They say that just as Allah forbade certain foods because He didn't want us to suffer the harm of consuming them, He also said that when you are dealing with uncertainty, you don't have to go and do that research in every individual case. And this also is because Allah did not deem it necessary, or He did not deem it good for us to do all of that detailed research in each and every individual case. If I am the type of person who always does that individual research, it means that I will not be able to be comfortable eating in my friends or my family members or my community members' homes. I might not even be able to eat all of the food or the meals that are provided by many different Islamic centers or organizations. I might have to live a very marginal or an abnormal or a very precautionary life, and that means that it is going to take my mental energy and my time, and therefore I will not be able to devote that time to other things which are perhaps more important in the eyes of Allah. Who are we to say that the harm that I am going to suffer by accidentally consuming an enzyme, not deliberately, but accidentally consuming an enzyme which was not meant to be consumed, is greater than the harm I am going to suffer by exercising precaution in an excessive manner? And by making life difficult for other people, you tell 10 people that you have to avoid all of these things, and some of them are liable to say that, well, forget this whole regime of halal and haram, it's too much for me. So you can keep it, and you can practice it, but I am going to go and take life much more easily. So these are also harms. Who's right? This is where it is relevant, and it is important for us to see what are the parameters of that good life that Allah has mentioned for us. What is the big picture? It helps us resolve many of these issues that if we come down to the individual issue, it is difficult for us to understand in that same manner. Not that it is impossible for us to resolve these issues when we look at them individually, but it is far easier for us to understand how we are to live our life when we see the big picture. Now, in this case, we see that Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salatu wassalam had two different types of focus. Please recite salawat. Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. When it comes to food, and I will not go into all of the details, but Ahlul Bayt did not engage in excessive precaution when it comes to food, especially if that food was prepared or served by a Muslim. They said that you don't need to go and ask and research and say to a person exactly how did you prepare this and where did you get this from. If it is from a Muslim and you are buying it, or they have cooked it and they are serving it to you, then assume that what they are doing is right and consume it even if you're not 100% sure. Now this is the general rule and the practice of Ahlul Bayt themselves. When it came to certain foods like cheese or other foods which were controversial. They are controversial today. They were also controversial in the time of the imams themselves. And the imams said that we actually go and we buy these things from the market and we consume them. It is not our concern to try to go and find out behind every morsel how it was prepared. That is not our obligation as a believer or even as an imam. But there is another area where the imams did place a great deal of emphasis. And this is that same bite, is it from a halal source or not? And that is where it is a pity that many of those Muslims who will read the entire ingredient list and they will make sure that they are not consuming something which is questionable, they won't give the same amount of attention to whether they have been entirely honest with the person that they are engaging in a transaction with. If there is a restaurant and they have been undercharged, will they make sure to go and correct that mistake and say that I want to pay it in full? If they have purchased something from a store, will they make sure that they are not taking any unfair advantage of anybody that they are engaging in a transaction with? If they are engaging in a transaction with a Muslim, will they make sure not just not to be unfair and to not cheat or lie or embezzle? Those are sins. But we see that the imams would even enforce a higher standard. It is said that once one of the servants or those who would serve our sixth Imam, Imam Ja'far Sadiq alayhi salatu wassalam, was entrusted by the Imam with a certain amount of money. The Imam said that I want you to take this money, buy some merchandise, and then go with a caravan, I think it might have been to Egypt or wherever it was, and engage in business. This was known as mudaraba, that the Imam gave the capital and he was in fact training and raising one of those people who was part of his household to be able to be self-sufficient. So he said that you will engage in the actual effort and I will provide the capital and we will divide the profits between us. So the Imam will receive his share and the one who is doing the work will receive his share. So it said that that person, he did as he was told by the Imam. He joined a trade caravan. When that person reached the city that they were going to go and sell their merchandise in, there was a group of traders who were leaving that city. And they said, you know, this merchandise that you have bought, it's rare in this city. People are looking for it. There's a shortage. And so, you know, you can get a good price for it. And so this person who had gone along with that caravan, all of them were presumably Muslims. This was also a person from the household of our sixth Imam. He said that we all made an agreement that we're going to not undercut one another, because this merchandise is in demand, it is in short supply. We can get a good price, but if some of us start undercutting one another, then it might be the case that we will undersell and we won't maximize our profit. The people we sell to, then they might be able to profit. So why don't we collude with one another, maintain the maximum price that we can get? And that is what they did. So they sold their merchandise, and then this person was very happy. He said that this is going to be a very successful trip. He came back to Medina, and he gave 2 bags to the Imam. One was the container that had the original capital that the Imam had provided. And one was the bag that had the profit. And so the Imam said, this is much more than I thought you would be able to earn on this transaction. To double your profit in one transaction, that is quite surprising. I believe the amount had been doubled at that time. Whatever it was far more than the Imam had planned for and had expected. How did you do this? And so that person said, very happy, very proud, that, well, we found out that this material was in short supply. We agreed with one another that we're not going to undercut or undersell one another, and we were able to obtain a high price. Now, the response of the Imam is very interesting. He said, here is the capital that I gave, and I'm going to take back my original capital, the principal, the money that I had given you. As for the profit, keep it all. I don't want to have any part of it, because you and your traveling companions colluded to make a market that would sell to the Muslims as at high a price as possible, a form of an unfair or a high-pressure selling tactic for Muslims. To extract the greatest amount of benefit for your own self among Muslims, that is not something that the Imam wanted to enter into his own property. Now the Imam could have said that, well, you overstepped what you should have done, it was makruh, as long as there was no hoarding that was going on, there was no ihtikar that was going on, it was not haram. It is not that it was necessarily haram to do what that person did. But the Imam said that is not how we deal with fellow Muslims. That is not how we deal with our fellow believers, especially, it's not necessarily how we should deal with any human being, but especially somebody who is a brother, who is a sister. Imagine if I am approached by my own family member, that can you help me buy a car? And I start rubbing my hands and I say, this is the time for me to maximize my product. I'm going to milk him for every cent he has. Anybody who hears about it will say that that is not really a worthy family member. We are to treat all of our fellow believers as being our family and our relatives on some level. Not necessarily quite that close, not necessarily that I won't take any profit, but certainly in a case where I am looking out for their best interests just as I am looking out for my best interests. At the very least, I'm looking out for their interests equal to my attention to my own interests, if not more so. To do more so is actually good. But at the very least, I should not put myself first and put them last. So assuming that what this person did is not haram, the Imam could have said that, well, you shouldn't have done it, don't do it next time, but let's split the profits. The Imam also could have said that, well, I would have expected a fair rate of return to have been, for example, 40%, for example, 20%. So I will take my share according to what would have been fair, and you figure out the rest. But the Imam did not take either of those courses of action. He said that what you did is something that I want to have absolutely no part of. That is not how I treat the Muslims. That is not how I want to earn my livelihood. This is not the type of product that I want to enter into my household and then be the source by which I buy my clothes, by which I buy my food, by which I serve my family and my children, and by which I run the affairs of my household. So the Imam said that we will withhold the benefit. We will withdraw from that benefit, even if it means that for that 5 or 6 months, in a sense, the Imam was deprived of his capital, and he also deprived himself of the profit. So here we can see where the focus of the Imam lies. It's not about simply making sure that we take care to make sure that there is no questionable ingredient in each and every morsel of our food. I'm not saying that is always a bad thing to do. But what I am saying is that the relative focus that we find from our Imams is that it is the licitness, the permissibility, and the well-being of our transactions, the moral and ethical usage that we make of our capital that is more important to our spiritual health and to our salvation, and to what effect that morsel will have on ourselves and our family than it is for us to worry about those ingredients. Now, it is especially unfortunate when we see that the two extremes come together. Extreme care on the legal or the fiqhi requirements, and extreme disregard for the ethical and the moral requirements and the way of dealing with our fellow believers. But how can we resolve that? We understand these issues when we look at the priorities and the larger picture of what it is that Islam wanted us to accomplish, how it is that Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salatu wanted us to be. So when we have believers and we find a masjid or a Muslim community, we shouldn't think that, all right, this is now a new place for me to acquire clients and customers and market myself and derive benefit. We should think that this is a place for me to give benefit and also to earn a dignified and a right and a reasonable livelihood. But anytime we are dealing in a commercial or in a business capacity with a member of our community, we should first make the decision that I am going to be looking out for the other person as much as I am looking out for myself. And if I know that I can't do that, then I'm better off saying that I am not going to deal with the community than to say that I am going to do so, but then cause ill feelings, cause bad blood, cause divisions, and in sometimes actually damage the goodwill and the fabric of that community in a way that it is difficult for others or for that community to repair. So this is an important point, and we see this very clearly demonstrated in the method and in the priorities of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salatu wassalam. Please recite salawat. Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So the basic point that I wanted to make is that it is the relative priorities of our religion, the large picture, that is going to inform the individual decisions that we make. It is very seldom that we will run the risk of thinking something that is bad is good. Even a person who doesn't believe in Islam, or who doesn't believe in any religion at all, is not likely to come and say, you know what, I woke up this morning and I just realized that murder is actually a good thing, especially murder of innocence. There are many people who do things like that. And in some cases, the lack of a strong moral compass or the lack of a religious sense of responsibility can cause a person not to understand the gravity of the bad decisions that he or she is making. That is true. But it is a rare case for a person to completely misunderstand what is right and what is wrong. Theft, dishonesty, these types of sins, they are things that a religious person, a non-religious person, among religious people, a Muslim or a non-Muslim, a Shi'i or a Sunni, we can all understand. The difference comes, though, in an understanding of the relative priority of these different good or bad things. When is it more important for me to be honest than to protect my material or my property or even my own life? When is it more important for me to protect my own life or somebody else's life than for me to tell the truth? Is it ever permissible for me to stretch the truth or even to tell an untruth in order to serve some greater purpose? What are those greater purposes? In which cases is murder to be, or is killing to be inexcusable? And are there ever any cases where it is permissible or it is actually required to engage in warfare or to engage in a battle? Should a Muslim or should a moral person be a pacifist, or should we not be a pacifist? These types of questions, they are questions where our faith and our religion will inform our decisions. It is not the case that we are going to all of a sudden have some earth-shattering, terribly unpredicted result that is going to tell us that this is a new moral code that you never would have been able to understand or appreciate had you not had religion. That is not the purpose that religion comes to serve. In fact, I can go one step further and say that if there were a religion that brought that type of a moral code, you could reject that religion on its face. In fact, one of the reasons why we as Muslims connect so deeply to Islam, intellectually and emotionally and spiritually and on every other level, is because it is not earth-shatteringly different from our fitrah and our nature and our inclination. It doesn't tell us that any power or any passion or any emotion that Allah has given us has no place or is completely unfounded or has to be eliminated from our life. Islam does not tell us to take a vow of poverty. Islam does not tell us to take a vow of celibacy. Islam does not tell us that anger is always wrong. Islam tells us that if Allah has given you that desire for passion, if Allah has given you that propensity to get angry, if Allah has given you that desire to compete and to be the best, all of those inclinations that Allah has given you, they are good and they have their place. When they are used right, they are noble and they bring you closer to God. And when they are misused, they are evil and they take you further away from God. Everything that is within our disposition and within our fitrah, it has its proper place. If there were a religion that were to go against our fitrah, that would be one reason why we would be justified in rejecting that religion. And we could stand before Allah on the Day of Judgment, and we could say that you created us with this nature. You created us with this mind, and this heart, and this soul, and this disposition. If you wanted us to follow a religion that told us to do something which went against our fitrah, then you should have created us with a fitrah that was appropriate to that religion. But based on this religion that you created us with, we could not but follow the dictates and the call of our soul. Islam is the religion that is in accord with the fitrah, and that is why we as Muslims follow this religion. It's not just an intellectual decision. It's not a mathematical decision that we have proved the correctness of Islam in a philosophical or theological or intellectual sense or a mathematical sense. But it is that Islam has answered the needs and the curiosity and each of the needs of our soul. And because it provides us with that answer, we accept it as the truth. So my point is that Islam is not going to, or any religion that is going to have a claim on a person's obedience, cannot go against the fitrah and give something completely misunderstood or unable to be understood. That is why we as Muslims say that the Trinity is to be rejected on its face, because it is something which our mind cannot accept. And something which our mind cannot accept is not something that is going to be revealed from the source and the creator of that mind, and from the creator of intellect, and from the creator of humanity. Just as something that our mind cannot accept is not to be from Allah, something that our heart cannot accept will not be from Allah, something that our nature cannot accept will not be from Allah. That is something which I will explain in a little bit more detail, because it can be misunderstood. But I want to move on. The next step of this realization is for us to say that as Muslims, when we want to understand what the promise of that good life is, we have to be in touch with what it is that our soul is actually yearning for. Otherwise, it will be impossible for us to live the good life that Allah has promised and that He has prepared for us. There are many, many different types of different veils, different coverings, different curtains that we place on our soul. And so we might be enjoying a certain blessing, but we think of it as something which is detrimental to our health or to our well-being. I want to give an example, but please recite salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. Take the suffering of the Shia community throughout the world. All of us are familiar with the attacks that the followers of Ahlul Bayt have been subjected to throughout their history, and especially in this day and age. If you look at Pakistan, there is the recent bombing just over a week ago in Quetta in Pakistan. That was the last in a series of very brutal and very callous attacks that have targeted the Shia community and innocent people throughout the country of Pakistan. Similar types of attacks have been the rule for many years in Iraq and in other countries as well. And we can just go on naming the places where people are suffering. Does that mean that Allah has forgotten His promise? Does that mean that Allah has taken away that promise that He will give the believers a good life? Can we say that this suffering is proof that then the Shia are not believers because they are persecuted and they are suffering? Believe it or not, in history there were people who actually made that argument. They would come to the followers of Ahlul Bayt and they would say, let me tell you the history of your oppression. You were marginalized at this time. You were attacked by this king. You were banished from this land and from that land. Your scholars, your prominent people, your most pious and well-known figures, they were imprisoned. They were put in jails. they were prevented from speaking. They were put under house arrest. In some cases, they were martyred. In some cases, they were made to flee to the frontiers of the Islamic world. How can you say that your religion is the correct religion, or that you have the favor of Allah with you, when you have never had a moment's peace from the time of the Prophet until today? Some people actually made that argument. And there might be some times when within our own heart that question rises up as well. That, well, if Allah has promised this good life, the best of this life and the best of the hereafter, the very minimum requirement is that a person be able to live their life with peace and with dignity. But the reality is that our fitrah is something which is very deep and very profound. And this is what I was speaking of earlier, that it is possible to think that something goes against our fitrah, when in reality it is not against our fitrah. But we have moved away from our fitrah. There are veils and curtains that have covered up what we know of our own nature, so that we think something does not harmonize with what we need and what we want and what our soul yearns for, when in reality it is the very best thing for us. If you want to understand what it is that our soul needs, then it is that connection to truth. It is that connection to the infinite source of goodness and guidance and salvation, that understanding of our purpose within the world. When we have an understanding of the purpose that we fulfill within the world, then the superficial reality of our existence, it doesn't cause us that pain or that worry. Whether we live in ease or in difficulty, whether we have wealth or whether we have poverty, whether we are on good terms with our family, or in some cases even when we have family trouble and we have difficulties within those relationships, that is something that will not cause us a great deal of concern or worry, because we have discovered what the purpose of our life is. And the practice of Ahlul Bayt is that when Allah reveals to them what test He wants to take from them, then they have absolute peace and absolute tranquility. They say, this is the very best thing that we can ever ask for, and we would not ask Allah for a moment to undo that which He has deemed best for us. That is something which we find quoted in different times in the lives of the prophets and the messengers of Allah, our own Prophet Muhammad Mustafa sallallahu alayhi wa alihi, and his successors. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Just one example from the life of Prophet Ibrahim, we have in a hadith that when Ibrahim alayhi salam was being catapulted into that large bonfire that the evil king of his time, Nimrud, had created for him, he was approached by the most noble angel of Allah, Jibreel. And he was asked that, "Oh Ibrahim, do you have anything that you need? Is there a hajat or a dua or a need that you have so that I can fulfill it?" And Ibrahim replied that, "As to you, no. I have a need and a hajah, but that need is going to be mentioned to Allah, and then whatever way Allah wishes to respond and whatever test He wishes to place me in, then that is not something that I would wish to undo. If Allah wishes, He can save me from this fire and He can give me a completely different situation than what I have been suffering until now. And if Allah wishes, then He can cause me to suffer the harm that these people are intending for me, and if that is what Allah wishes, then I would not wish for anything else." It is said in the time of our sixth Imam, Imam Ja'far Sadiq alayhi salatu wassalam, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad, that there was a young member of the Imam's household who became ill. And when that child became ill, the Imam showed an amount of jaza'. Jaza' is unease, discomfort, concern, worry. The Imam would have tears on his face, and he would be praying to Allah and making nadhr and dua that, "Oh Allah, preserve the life of this young child, of this member of my household." So that jaza' the Imam was showing, and people might have been a little bit surprised that as the Imam, as somebody who is so noble, why would the Imam be doing this? But then what is even more interesting is that it is said in history that that young child passed away. And when that child passed away, now the Imam's jaza' came to an end. And so people who might have been surprised that the Imam was worried before, they were even more surprised that the Imam is not increasing in his worry, in his tears, in his concern now. They came to the Imam. They said, Yabna Rasulullah, O grandson of the Messenger of God, what is the state that we have seen you engaging in? And the Imam said that we are the members of a household, the household of the Prophet. That before a certain bala or a musibah or a trial comes to us, we show that concern and that worry. Because at that time, we don't know what it is that Allah is going to decree for us. What is it that Allah wants? And that is our obligation, that we make the effort to seek afiyah and to seek the very best result that Allah can give to a person. We are not to say with our own devices that, well, maybe it's better if I don't get the job. Maybe it's better if I suffer at this time. There is actually a hadith that when Yusuf alayhi salam, the story is mentioned in the Quran in Surah Yusuf, when he said that, oh Allah, the prison is better for me than these evil deeds that the people in Egypt are inviting me towards, Allah decreed that he go to prison at that time. And the hadith of our Imam say that if Yusuf, instead of saying, I would rather go to prison than to have to suffer the invitation to these evil deeds, instead of that, if Yusuf had said that, oh Allah, grant me afiyah and grant me freedom of worry from what these people wish to drag me into in sin and in evil, and grant me the freedom from imprisonment, then Allah would have granted him afiyah from both types of hardship and both types of tribulation. Not that Yusuf made a mistake. Yes, being imprisoned is better than being in sin, because sin is a prison that will last for all eternity. A worldly prison, it can come to an end, and as the story of Yusuf itself demonstrates, it can lead to the greatest material and worldly blessings that alone to success and salvation in the hereafter. So Yusuf didn't make a mistake, but he didn't make the prayer in the very best way that he could. It is the duty of us, when we are uncertain of what is going to happen and we don't know what Allah has decreed, to seek the very best decree, to pray for and to work towards afiyah, goodness. I can't say that I have trouble in my corporate life, in my business life, in my career, in my educational life, in my family life, in whatever area of life I have. And well, let's see which way the chips may fall. Let's see what Allah decrees for me. Allah might punish me for being passive. He might punish me for being inactive. I have to show concern. I have to show worry. I have, if I'm sick or a family member is sick, to go and seek medical attention. Our Imams went and they sought medical attention. You are all familiar with the story of when Imam Ali alayhi salam was poisoned, when Imam Hassan was poisoned, and when our other Imams were poisoned. One of the people who was always present at the deathbed of our Imams, or who was invited, was a medical professional according to the learning of their times. Their Imams would invite them and seek their advice and seek their treatment, because that is what Allah has ordered. The cure, the benefit or the harm is in the hands of Allah, but these are means which we are to use. So as long as we are unsure what Allah has decreed for us, we have to make use of those resources. And if we do not make use of those resources, and if we do not pray, and we do not show that jaza and that concern, then we are negligent in our duty. Now, having made that point, the mistake that we often make is that when Allah has shown us that you made your best effort, you had a dispute with a family member, and you went to your brother or to your sister and tried to resolve it and fulfill your obligation to the best of your ability, and then it didn't work out, not because you were passive and inactive, but because the other person did not cooperate, or not because you were negligent, but because circumstances did not support you and did not allow your efforts to reach their proper fruition. At this point, some of us, we come with a complaint to Allah, that Allah, I prayed this much, I did this many du'as, I called people and we did this dhikr 100,000 times, and even still you did not accept it? I made these efforts, I knocked on every door, and still you did not allow me to be successful in my efforts? We come with a complaint after we have made our efforts, and after Allah has shown us through the way that He runs the affairs of our lives, that what He had planned for us is not in accordance with what we had hoped or we had planned for ourselves. And this is where the Imam says that before the bala comes, then you are to show that worry and that concern, because that is what it means to be proactive. That is what it means to leave no stone unturned in order to seek the very best result that you can seek through usage of the material means that Allah has placed at your disposal, the resources that He has given you, and also through the resource of prayer and asking Allah. But then when Allah has shown you that you wanted this person to live, but Allah has said that no, it is time for me to take this soul back and bring it into my own company. Even if I think that that person should have lived many, many more years, but when Allah has shown me that He wished for something else, then I should say that, oh Allah, You knew better than I did. And that is the advice that our Imams would give. There was once a person who wanted to have a son. This was a common sickness that people had throughout Islamic history and even today in some cultures. They wish to have children, but they want to decide whether it's going to be a son or a daughter, and they're disappointed if it's the wrong result, if they don't have the child that they wish to have. So our sixth Imam is reported to have just given one very simple reply to a person who was showing that disappointment. I wanted a son and I was given a daughter. According to the narration, I believe that person had several daughters and now they were hoping to finally be able to have a son. The Imam said that before this child was born, before you became disappointed, if you were going to be asked that, you know what, you can choose the gender of your child, a son or a daughter, or you can have Allah choose. Tell me, who would make a better choice? Would you make the better choice or would Allah make the better choice? And the person said, well, of course Allah would make the better choice. The Imam said, Allah did make a choice. It's not that Allah would or Allah could, Allah did. And Allah always will. But do you recognize it? Or do you exercise your own judgment and say that, oh Allah, no, in this case you made a mistake. You might be all-knowing, but I am more all-knowing than you in this case. You don't have my best interests at heart. That is what we do in effect when we exercise our own opinion in the face of what Allah has shown us to be His decree for our life. When it is a matter of our own negligence, we should be worried. We should be regretful. But when it is a matter of what Allah has done for us, then we should not have any kind of worry or any kind of concern. So when we understand the purpose of our life, then we do not have any desire to undo that which Allah has decreed for us. And that is one step for us living the good life. To understand that Allah has a purpose for us. And it might not always be what we thought we were going to do, and the way that we thought we were going to live, but it is the very best life that we can live. And that is why we see that our role models and the progeny of the Prophet, no matter what difficulties they were faced with in life, whenever it came time for the trial, they did not flee from that trial. They never fled from a battlefield. They never showed disappointment. But they would come to the battlefield and they would say, oh Allah, grant us martyrdom in this battle if we are worthy, and if we are not worthy, then grant us martyrdom in the future. Delay the martyrdom if you see it best for us, but do not deprive us of living and dying a martyr's death. On the day of Ashura, we see that Imam Hussein alayhi salam, he gave many sacrifices. But the historian of the enemy army, Humayd ibn Muslim, himself says, and other chroniclers and soldiers later on, when they would recount what they witnessed of the grandson of the Prophet of God in the battle on the day of Ashura and the way that he went forth, they said that we had never seen a soldier who had suffered as the Imam suffered. He had been deprived of water. He had seen so many of his own family members suffer. He had been awake for so long with very little time to rest or to get any sleep. He had gone to the battlefield and lifted with his own arms and brought back to his camp members of his followers and members of his family and even young children. He had gone to the battlefield so many times in order to retrieve those young soldiers and those martyrs from the clutches of the enemy, that he had already been wounded and blood was gushing from every part of his body before he had gone to the battlefield even once to do battle. They said that we had never seen a person who had lost so much, who had suffered so much, who had been wounded so much, who was so thirsty, and who was so surrounded and was coming coming into a hopeless battlefield from a material and a military perspective, and yet who was so confident and who was so brave that in whichever direction he would face, all of the enemy soldiers would flee. There would be nobody who would be able to stand up to the Imam and say that I am covered with armor and the Imam is covered with wounds. I have soldiers behind me and the Imam has children and women who are weeping behind him. I will be able to stand up to the Imam in battle. Whichever way Imam Hussein turned, it is said the enemy fled before him until they were only able to do battle by surrounding him. It was a cowardly battle that they did. In the hadith of our fifth Imam, Imam Baqir, it is said that my grandfather Hussein was not martyred in the way that battlers or soldiers are martyred in a battlefield. It is as if a cruel company had gone hunted in the jungle and they found the prey that they wished to hunt, and then they surrounded that prey from all sides, and then they began to attack that animal in order to remove any sign of life from it and to exert their vengeance against their prey. That is how my grandfather was not killed in battlefield, but he was hunted as if he were the prey that those hunters were seeking. That is how the enemy surrounded Imam Hussein. And yet even until the very final moments, when he did not have the strength to stand in battle, when the Imam did not have the strength to lift his sword, when he was not able to do battle with his arms, he continued with his lips to show that his spirit had not been broken. His understanding of his mission and his connection to the very essence of Islam had not been compromised at all. It is said that the very final words that Imam Hussein recited as he fell from his horse and he fell onto the ground was that he began to put his head into prostration, and he said that I am leaving this world on the path of Islam. I am leaving this world Bismillahi wa billahi wa ala millati Rasulillah. Imam Hussein alayhi salatu wassalam gave us the very best example that living a good life and living hayat tayyibah is not about having comfort or having ease or having all of those material luxuries that we may seek, but it is about being able to live our life in such a way that no matter where we might be and what we might suffer, we would be able to say with full confidence that we would not be anywhere else. We have no regrets. We have no place in our life where we say that we wish we had done this instead of what we actually did. Imam Hussein gave his life and he was subjected to that martyrdom, but he was able to lead that life that was an example for all humanity for all time. And we pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that as we leave these days of mourning for the martyrs of Karbala and Imam Hussein, that he makes us Husseini in our ideals, in our word and in our deed. And by the blessings of Imam Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam, that he protect us and our families and our near and dear ones and our descendants until the day of judgment from sin and from deviation and from evil, and that he keep us true to the path of Islam and true to the path of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salatu wasalam. May Allah forgive our sins and shortcomings. May he fulfill our prayers and our needs and our hajat. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hasten the appearance of the Imam of our time and count us among his true and sincere followers. Salawat.
Hussein, 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 Hussein.